Thank you very much, Inga. And I must say that it's a great fun to be here in Reykjavik again, to be back in Reykjavik. And I think it's a great honor to be able to have been invited to be a speaker at the Nordic Academy of Management conference. But now I'm going to have a serious talk, and you can have fun afterwards, okay? What I do think is that studying organizations in the sense of formal entities can in fact obscure quite important and quite frequent nowadays instances of organizing. So I have three sort of statements that I'm going to develop somewhat, and they are as follows. In the first place, there exists organizing without organizations. Secondly, there exists organizing between organizations. And finally, there is organizing in spite of organizations. So to begin with the first one, there is an obvious example of organizing through computers and through internet and through the web. I'm quoting here Clay Shirky, "Here Comes Everybody," on the power of organizing without organizations. And I'm sure that you will tell me that this is an internet hype. Well, it is partly an internet hype, but he has quite a few points, no matter how over-optimistic he may be. The web permits, as we know, exchange of information, not the least through blogging. Okay, I know that blogging is mostly exchange of opinions, but information is being exchanged as well. The web permits collaboration. Wikipedia is perhaps the best example of a fantastic global cooperation on a sort of common knowledge project as it is. And I know that many of you think, as I thought, that the Wikipedia is very unreliable, and if you really want to have something, to know something, you have to go to Encyclopedia Britannica on paper and check it. But I can tell you that recently I've learned from a book by Norman Davies, who did a very thorough comparative study of Wikipedia and Encyclopedia Britannica and other very famous encyclopedias, and he can prove that there is as much nonsense in both and as much correct information in both. So don't be afraid of Wikipedia. And of course, mass action, political protests, and not only that. And I think that especially recently, reading the news and watching the news, we can see those incredible examples of organizing that happens via social networks and via internet. Of course, there is Occupy Wall Street, and there is Arab Spring, or the beginning of it at least, but there are also football hooligans and other things. So it's not like maybe Clay Shirky would want it, that it's always for the good, but the fact is it is happening, and it is amazing. But actually, and I don't know, I don't see Niels Brunson here, but he would probably immediately protest and say that it will not lead to anything unless a formal organization will be formed. There can be something to it, actually. At the famous eruption of the Icelandic volcano, some of us were in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, on Lemos, which is the sort of Latin America variations of Igos. And one of Keynote speakers, Giorgio Alberti, had a very interesting talk there. He was analyzing social movements in Latin America, and he claimed that when they sort of got to power, they were completely useless because they didn't understand that being a state power and being in the sort of state apparatus requires a completely different organization than social movements have. So maybe there is something to it. Maybe those two coexist uneasily. Another example is, I don't know whether you remember, it's an older view, the famous the Greens in Germany, and at the time it was Petra Kelly and the general. Petra Kelly was one of the founders of the German Green Party in 1979. At the beginning, for a good 4 years, they were very much opposed any kind of joining to the system because they were against the system. But then, and especially Petra Kelly said it, that, you know, if we do not join the system, we will never achieve anything. So between 1983 and 1990, she was a member of the Bundestag, complaining all the time about compromises and wondering whether she was not sort of betraying her ideas and the whole movement of the Greens. Then there is organizing between organizations. And you will tell me immediately that this has been studied, and because it's a very well-known phenomenon, sort of, you know, inter-organizing and all that. Right, but as we, my colleagues and I who studied city management, discovered very early, for great many practicing managers, the idea of working between organizations means sort of making formal networks. And then, sooner or later, they discovered that formal networks do not lead anywhere, especially. Well, I don't have to remind you how it works with the university networks. Like our School of Business, we have a big table on one of the walls, and there is a list of universities with whom we have a formal cooperation. Now, nobody has any contacts with them, of course. They are just formal cooperations. The contacts are happening quite differently, either by private contacts or, and here's my point, because something needs to be done. And then you look for not for your best chum or for the closest university, but for somebody who can do what you need. So what was sort of what we suggested as in the final version of our reports from the city studies is that city management actually could be conceived as a particularly complex and quite disorderly action net, in a sense of sort of web of inter-organizational networks, where the city administration proper, you know, where it says this is a city council and this is a city mayor, they're just some points of entry. And by no means these points of entry and the sort of map of them provides a map of the entire terrain. So the idea of that the cities can work because appropriate actions, collective actions, are connected to other appropriate collective actions. If somebody wants to put a cable down, somebody has to dig a hole, and so on and so forth. And as you very well know, this idea of action nets has been inspired by actor network theory. And this is very shortly for those of you who are less familiar with this theory. It is a theory launched by the French sociologists Bruno Latour and Michel Calon, but that was greatly inspired by Algirdas Gremas, a French-Lithuanian narratologist, because they thought, well, apart from the fact that it was at that time in the 70s, very popular to go to his courses, but they decided that narratology can be very useful in understanding how the social is assembled, actually. So what they suggest is that you study is that you begin with identifying the actants, as they say, that is, those which act and are acted upon. Observe that I said which and not who, because they could be humans or not humans as well. And then a study follows that trajectory of various series of programs and anti-programs. They mostly study technological projects, but not only. So, you know, like the Kodak Eastman Kodak starts doing the cameras and somebody else tries to stop them, and then, you know, they look who wins. And usually, it is the actants that establish associations and stabilize those associations can become true actors or even macro actors. Well, one could say why was and not enough? Well, because it's not a criticism, because they studied what they wanted to study, but from our point of view, from the study of business and administration, the ANT did not or does not focus on the kind of organizing that does not lead to construction of actors. Actually, it would be very interesting to study, I don't want to be macabre, but in the face of the financial crisis, it would be interesting to see how macro actors are being distracted, how they disorganize. I mean, what does it take to stop being a macro actor? But they didn't do it. I do think that what we need is something more, not only the construction of macro actors, because this has been done, but even the organizing that does not lead to construction of any stable actors, or, as I said, disassembling of various actors. So I was, as you know, propagating this idea of action nets, that these two, of studying organizing as a process of connecting again, disconnecting various kinds of collective actions to one another. And these connections can be made in a sort of routine way, institutionalized way, or in an innovative way, completely different than before. And the relation between this kind of organizing and formal organization is sort of, they are partly overlapping, but not necessarily, because collective actions need not be performed within the bounds of a formal organization. And an action net can involve action performed by many different formal organizations, or simply by assemblies of various human and non-human actants. And actions in an action net can be connected temporarily or loosely and temporarily, or be stabilized. One thing which fascinates me a lot is the fact that formal organizations can actually be obstacles to organizing. Inga mentioned to you that I've written about it more, but I think we are not paying enough attention to this fact. And in a sense, we could go back to the sort of old definition of organization by Charles Perrault, who claimed that formal organizations are tools just to accomplish various kinds of collective actions. So if they are tools, then we can see them as things, as objects, as products, and as artifacts, virtual or physical. And in such a view, organizations can be seen literally as instrumental. That is, either they work or they don't work. And like Karl Weick said, if they don't work, they should be dropped. I mean, the tools that do not work should be dropped. But you know very well how difficult it is to drop tools that do not work. And Weick's example are tragic and concerned firemen who go to death clinging to their tools. Maybe in our world, the world of organizations, the instances are not tragic, but there's certainly a tendency to cling to organizations that do not work. And also, it has to do, of course, put the design in a different matter. The organizations can be designed well or not so well, but it's obvious also that they will never be designed perfectly, because, like with all tools, it is the user who finally decides what is happening. So, I'm afraid I may irritate some of you, but even the state can be seen as an obstacle. And I think there is a very interesting book, I think, It's James C. Scott, you know, the guy who wrote Seeing Like a State, and now he wrote, among others, because he wrote a very big historical study, but he summed it up in a short book called 2 Cheers for Anarchism. And this is what he says there. Forms of informal cooperation, coordination, and action that embody mutuality without hierarchy are the quotidian experience of most people. Most villages and neighborhoods function precisely because of the informal transit networks of coordination that do not require formal organization, let alone hierarchy. The existence, power, and reach of the nation-state over the centuries may have undermined the self-organizing capacity and hence resilience of individuals and small communities. The state, arguably, destroys the natural initiative and responsibility that arise from voluntary cooperation. This is not to be against the state. This is what to sort of remind you of this very important, I think, definition of organized suggested by Karl Weick so long time ago. Organizing as the process of assembling ongoing interdependent actions into sensible sequences that generate sensible outcomes. I think sensible is a very important adjective here because judging from some papers in our track, the new experiments in public sector, at least in Swedish public sector, can really, do not deserve the adjective sensible, but we shall see. And further, the results of organizing is interlocked cycles, which can be represented as causal loops rather than as a linear chain of causes and effects. Organizing is an ongoing encounter with ambiguity, ambivalence, and equivocality, a part of a larger attempt to make sense of life and the world. So, if so, what is needed, and this is another quote from a book by Boltanski and Thévenot, and I can tell you, those who didn't read the book, that it's a horrible reading, but it's worth it. So, you know, suffer through it. I encourage you. So what they say, what is needed is a new and systematic approach to organizations, construed not as unified entities characterized in terms of spheres of activity, systems of actors, or fields, but as composite assemblages that include arrangements deriving from different worlds. They're speaking about the worlds of value, and they're saying that exactly formal organization are sort of sites where different worlds of value meet and very often fight with one another. So the question is, does such an approach exist? And there is this sort of relatively new idea of meshworks. Meshworks as the products of contemporary organizing. So in my understanding of the word, of the concept, it would be the fact that because we have both action nets and networks of organizations and networks of persons together, maybe we could be speaking exactly about meshworks. The concept has been sort of launched by an anthropologist, Manuel de Landa, who said, hierarchies components have been sorted out into homogeneous groups, then articulated together. You know, you have to first separate functions or departments or whatever, and then you put them into a hierarchy. Meshworks, on the other hand, articulate heterogeneous components as such, without homogenizing them. So this sounds very good, but I'm not sure that this is quite correct. Because you see, if you check it on Wikipedia or any other dictionary, you will see, or encyclopedia, that there are quite different uses of meshworks. And the classical one, so to say, is an industrial, I wrote here industrial metaphor, but it's an industrial concept. I mean, what you see here are examples of meshworks. And it's obvious that the elements of a meshwork are highly homogenized, extremely homogenized. There is no diversity whatsoever. So the focus, in this sense, when you speak about meshworks, you are speaking about great many things connected very tightly together. It's density that is the point of the metaphor. But the assumption, what is taken for granted is that they are identical, that they are homogeneous. But this is not how it's been used in biology, in brain studies, and recently, again, as a city metaphor. So here is Marilyn Hamilton, who was very taken by the Landa's idea, and she says, meshworking is an intelligence of the human hive that creates a meshwork by weaving together the best of two operating systems, one that self-organizes and one that replicates hierarchical structures. Well, it's again quite a lot of a hype. There's a hype, I think, in this, the best of two operating systems, but Marilyn Hamilton is a consultant. But I do think that it's quite an important acknowledgement that the two operating systems do coexist and operate at the same time. But sometimes in unison, sometimes they really cooperate, and sometimes at odds. Sometimes they act against one another. So what happens is we can see in practice is that hierarchies become disorganized and anarchies become structured. And I think that this is perhaps the most sort of important aspect of contemporary organizing that we need to capture. For me, my recent study that Inga mentioned before of the news agencies was a very good example of this kind of meshwork organizing. That is, the fact that they depended on organizing that went in outside, inside, and between formal organizations. And their networks and action nets and actor networks were all meshed together, and where hierarchy and anarchy cohabited, not necessarily very peacefully or always peacefully. Actually, at Reuters, the hierarchy was one floor up, literally, not metaphorically, and the anarchy was, I mean, that this journalist was one under. But it was also interesting that with this incredibly complex double system, as it were, and the meshwork, there is no single worker inside who could or who needed to understand the working of the whole system. And I believe that there are more and more organizations and, let's say, activities and action nets that work exactly in this way. So my message would be, and you can agree or disagree or quarrel with me, that what it should be worthwhile to do nowadays is, first of all, and this is what I was thinking about going back to go forward, to return from so-called theory of organizations to organization theory. That is a theory that explains how an organized state is achieved without assuming that it already happened. See, here again is a parallel with Ant, who said that instead of treating power as a sort of a concept that explains everything, it needs to be explained in the first place. Same thing about organizations. Instead of assuming that they already are and they will be, the question is, how did they come to being and how long will they stay? Then I would also like in our sort of vocabulary to return the proper names to organizations, because nowadays everything is called organization. Because even if they're tools or instruments, as I suggested, tools differ. You don't use the same name for a hammer and for a saw. So they differ not the least in their purpose. So one could speak about company and city administration or association, and then we will know what we're speaking about rather than speaking about organizations. And, which I think is quite of a problem, it would be good not to mix processes of organizing with sites where they take place. Because that's, again, contemporary organizing is a global or localized, if you want, process. So, you know, if you sort of, if you take a site in the sense of this concrete place or a name of an organization, then you will be sort of missing what is happening outside and in spite of it. So, in general, I think what we need, what is needed, well, I don't know, I shouldn't be speaking for everybody. So what I feel is needed is that we should put more attention and put under scrutiny exactly the kind of organizing that is hidden by focus on organizations. Thank you.